Starting with the upper body, we would look at the measurements taken of the upper torso from the neck down to below the waist and down the arms, and then calculating the pattern measurements using the 10% reduction. The figures we'll need for the pattern are the ones written in red. Now, we're taking the full circumference of a torso times 0.45. That's giving you half the full circumference. But for the vest pattern, I actually want a quarter, so that we're looking at a half of the front and a half of the back, for instance. So the smaller measurement written to the right hand side is the measurement we'll be using for the dimensions of this pattern. The first measurement we'll use is the neck measurement, and the neck we don't reduce, but I divide it by 3 because you'll find that a third of that measurement lies to one side of the front neck, the other third to the other side of the front neck, and the final third would be across the back of the neck. And dividing that in half, that will give me the first measurement I need. Now I'm going to look at the amount of paper I need, adding up the distances of the measurements. It's come to 48 centimeters, so I'm looking for a piece of paper that is 48 centimeters long, and then I'm going to fold it over, so moving the actual measurements out of the way and using the paper that shows the calculations needed for the pattern. Imagine that we're folding it in half down that centre. We've got the length. We want to fold it in half so that the fold will represent the centre of the front, and we're looking at those quarter of the circumference, in fact, with the reduction calculation. So you're folding your paper down to use just those measurements. So we're looking for the widest we'd need, which is usually the armpit, although sometimes the hips can be wider. So looking for that measurement and making sure you've got adequate paper. Now this is where the neck is the most significant measurement, starting at the top from the neck. There is the full amount. There is a third of it, which will be the front half of the neckline, and with the tape measure curved conveniently, now you're doing a half of the back neckline, and that will give you the position of the shoulder point, the side of the neckline. So using that same half of the back neckline, which actually is there, draw a line that will be parallel to your fold, and that will be one of our major measurements in the construction of this pattern. Now we want to go at right angles, so I'll make the same distance down so that I am getting a right angle to the fold, and that will be the next baseline really. It's under the armpits, it's the measurement where the tape measures under the armpit. Now this diagonal is the raglan, so you've got the neck there, which a third of 33 is 11, and then half of the 11 is 5.5, and that will be the distance. Sometimes it isn't quite as you'd expect, but that's the distance from the front of the neckline to the first measurement under the armpit. Now this diagonal would be the raglan, and that's when the tape measure has been looped under the arm and joined at the corner of the neck, the edge of the neck I should say, where your neckline is going to be. And that we always realize it's got a slight curve, and the pattern needs to be cut with a slight curve so that it can be a right angle where it joins under the armpit on the side seam. So there we have got the first and most important part. Now we're working on the distances that go straight down the torso, much the easiest part of the pattern. you'll notice that to mark the positions that these measurements were taken is one of the first things. Whether you've decided the length of the garment and then broken that up into sensible distances in order to get a good graph, or whether they're actually on datum points such as between the breasts, under the breasts, and so forth. You now would make right angle lines to the fold, so I'm using the set squares, you can see, to just plot where those distances will be. And now I'm going to go back to seeing where the calculations have been written and making sure that we're on the correct position. This would be the one that would be across the breast. Now on a man it's all very well, but on a woman you don't actually plot that, although you might measure it for interest. You don't want the curve being under the armpit. So we're going as if this is a woman's chest, under the breast. Although for a man or a child you would use that measurement and you would go straight down the side. And here we are going down to the waist, and then slightly increased it seems as it goes beyond the navel. So this is the shape of the garment, whether it's a male, a female, or a child, and you're making a sympathetic curve. You're not doing a straight line with a ruler. Now what I'm indicating is that you wouldn't want that swell for the breast there, you would want it there on a female. And that is a significant problem to plot it in the correct place. You need some additional measurements, and one of them is the distance from that shoulder point or neckline, the edge of the neckline, down to the high point of the breast, and then to plot between that distance and the distance between the breasts and half. Use the reduction calculation, so if it were 20, your calculation would be 18.5, which would be 9 for instance. So now you've got the two lengths and you're plotting the point which we would say would be the high point of the breast. And bearing in mind you've got the line from under the armpit, and then you've got the line to where the breast breaks away from the skin, and then the measurement that was taken as close to under the breast as at all possible, and that's the place where the breast will break through the garment. So if you had a tube of a garment on the lady and you cut away under the breast would come through that area, and you would remove that piece of fabric in order for the breast to be able to be accommodated. The rest of the garment can then hold on to the torso, and you're now going to insert a cup to replace that flat piece of fabric with one that will allow for the fullness of the breast, and the different sizes of the breast will have been measured purely. I'm using the paper scissors, and I wouldn't use these on fabric, and I wouldn't use fabric scissors on the paper. They would blunt if they were used on the incorrect medium. So now working out what to do about the sleeve, we'll move straight on as if it were a man or a child or a woman. You take a separate piece of fabric and you see how wide that measurement is under the armpit, and then you'd have the raglan that would of course need to be exactly the same as the pattern for the raglan on the vest. So the raglan on the sleeve has to match, and that would be the measurement that is a cross section under the armpit, and then you've got your lengths down the arm for the sleeve. We're just going to make a short sleeve with two sections of 7 centimeters, and the calculations at those points, which once again we want to take a set square to get the right angle from the fold. Notice I had that piece of paper on top of the main body of the vest in order to get the raglan seam lined up and of the same size and length. And now I'm going to plot the widths of the sleeve. But very often you can see that that arm sleeve and the torso match up quite well. almost onto that axilla line. Now using a centimetre again for the hem allowance, and taking the measurement of the lower width of the sleeve and then joining it up once again with a smooth line, by no means a straight ruler line, and cutting this out with the paper scissors. It means I now have the two main pieces, pattern pieces of a vest, both of which still need a little bit more work, but let's get the sleeve lined up and make sure that those two will join. And there's something important here that I found is necessary on a sleeve, is I will fold back the point of the raglan to the first line, which is under the armpit, and that, if you slash on that fold and give it a little bit of extra pattern, you'll find that it's not quite the length that goes up and over the shoulder, because there is a considerable amount of stretch required to hug the shoulder on the raglan style, and so for it stretching in length as it goes over the shoulder. But that would be the shoulder, and that piece that is now not on the fold anymore becomes a dart that represents a shoulder seam. So that still matches up the raglan seams together. The part that varies from the fold now because of the angle you've moved it to, so that's the fold, and there would be a cut in the fabric which you join, and that would become the dart which represents a shoulder seam. Once again, writing on that pattern piece so that we don't lose it. Put the patient's name, put what it is, and in this case it's left and right sleeves. The fabric would be the beige, and the date, so that they'd all be linked up together by the same date when the pattern was made. Okay, so the basic pattern pieces for both a male and a child is just really the torso, and this piece that has been folded represents both the back and the front. I'm cutting away the front neckline, and the back neckline remains. There'd be some knit elastic or a hem edge for the front and the neckline, and then you'd have generally a zip running down the front on an adult so that they can dress themselves. We always think of our zips in inches because it's easier to talk about an 18-inch zip than however many centimetres that would be. And that zip is, bearing in mind it's going to go through some elastic edging, whether it be plush elastic or a silicone elastic on the edge. It's usually about an inch beyond the end of the pattern, because the pattern is for the fabric, and we add the trim of the elastic, and then the zip would stand over and run across the elastic at the top of the neck and the elastic at the bottom of the vest to hold the vest down and snug. So for instance, here is the zip, and we're going to place a bit of elastic on the top of the neck and a wider piece of silicone onto the bottom, and it's just edge to edge. We always stitch the elastic so we don't get a double layer of fabric that's harder to dry and tougher to wear. Once again, uniting this pattern piece to the sleeve, we're putting the patient's name, the fabric, basically that this is the front of the vest, and also the date. Now, the other piece, although it's joined to the front, it represents the back. Both of them would be cut on the fold, and then the front would be cut lower at the front neckline, and the back would just have the slight curve for the back neckline. The reason I leave them together is if I'm doing a quick calculation and want to see if it's going to fit a garment I already have, it's easier to use. Now, what I'm doing here, and I've opened it out so we can see better through the tracing paper, which in this case is quite clouded, the grey paper, but it is a bigger piece, is to be able to work out the cup. You need to be able to see where we would be taking the fabric away, because we need to meet and match what we are going to make that becomes the cup. So marking the edges there, that would be the lower seam, and it's as well to write it on. To free it up, and I'm using the calculation, or sorry, the measurement of the rise of the breast, which is from the flesh under the breast to that high point. That would be the amount of fabric we need to fill that gap. Now, lying it down upside down so that the part that we're joined together as the upper seam can be seen through there. And you'll find that this is now going to be the fabric that fills the gap. So we have to check that the measurement we took for the rise of the breast is going to be the height of that pattern piece. So taking away the fabric between these two lines, which is the upper seam and the lower seam, and filling it with this piece that we're going to produce as the breast cup. This will accommodate the bosom. Now, how to make a flat piece of paper into an adequate piece of fabric to accommodate the breast. You'll see that we've got an upper seam and a lower seam that match up, but we don't have a curve. That flat piece of paper would just push the breast out. As you can see, it won't curve and allow for the fullness of the breast. So how are we going to make that have a curve? We'll find the center of it, and we'll realize that we need to cut a dart. But to get the swell of the breast, we'll need a curve. So you'd either cut 4 pieces and have a seam down the center of the breast, as some bra cups do, or you'd put it on the fold and purely have an upper and a lower dart. And that would join together to be sufficient to fill the gap and hold the breast. Now, it's not by any means a support as a bra would be, with all the underboning and wires and firm seams. This is purely something that's going to cover the flesh, and in fact not put a lot of pressure on the breast. But a patient can wear a bra over it and have contact with the skin for any scarring that is in that area. So there we are, that's the pattern for a female breast, as the cup is just additional to the male or the child. This is what it looks like when it's made. There's some knit elastic on the top and some elastic on the bottom of the vest. This is a much shorter vest, and showing the dart on the top of the shoulder. And the cups that in this case are quite small cups, and those ones are not quite as big as these ones, which have got the curve in them. As you can see, this is the pattern that we've just made, and the garment showing you that we've got a slightly better design now with this underarm panel. Seems to give a better fit into the armpit. Perhaps you can see there that the panel is sewn on with a flat seam onto the front of the vest, and it allows for more movement of the arm without pulling up at the vest, and it seems to fit better into the armpit. So how to do this now to the pattern we've just made with the measurements that we've used. It's fairly simple to just remove a piece along the side of the pattern where the side seam would be, and if you were to remove enough to make a 5 centimetre panel, which seems to be about the right size to run up and under an adult armpit, in half that's 2.5 centimetres that's coming off the front and the back, and then you'd be careful to take the corner, otherwise you'll find you've pinched in rather than allowed for the armpit. Now here's a slight problem, is that it's right on the edge of the cup. So this is why you need to join those two pieces together before you work on adding the cup when you're sewing it, making it. But at the moment you're marking a 2.5 centimetre section, which is going to be cut away from this pattern, and because it's going to run up and through the armpit and down the sleeve, you need to cut the same 2.5 centimetres, once again being careful of the corner of the armpit area of the sleeve. You'd be removing that 2.5 centimetres from the pattern, but adding a 5 centimetre panel cut on the length, which would go all the way along from the torso of the vest through the armpit and down the sleeve. Now, how much will you need in length? You can see that this measurement on the body plus that distance on the sleeve will require about 40 to 50 centimetres. Call it 50 to be sure that you haven't skimped, that you'd cut out, and then as you've joined the pattern together at the raglan seam, you would then join that entire length of panel. As you can see, I'm going to cut the pattern so there's no error in that that's where we want the front of the pattern to be cut, and the sleeves are cut as well. But when you're joining this garment together, you mustn't forget that you will need that 5 centimetre panel, or else that person is going to be severely compromised in width. So you'd put a panel up the one side of the garment, and you'd put a panel up the other side of the garment. Here we're seeing the front and the back patterns, but in fact we'd have the front on the fold and we'd have the back on the fold as well, and either side you'd have a panel running up under the armpit and along the sleeve, giving exactly the same proportions as we did before. Now if we were sewing this together, the first seam would be the front raglans attached to the sleeves. On either side. And then just to show you what a 5 centimetre panel would be, we're going to sew the two arm sleeves together, the arm sleeve and the body together at the raglan. So we've set the two arms sleeves onto the vest at the front, and then run the panel up the side on either side. The next thing you'd want to do is put the bra cup into that area, which you'd mark on the front of the fabric, and then having sewn together the darts, you would sew the top and the bottom seams. I do them as a flat seam so the patient doesn't have any pinched seam sticking out. And then the next thing, I would sew the silicone onto the end of the fabric that's been cut from the pattern, and then be able to put the open end zip onto the edge of that elastic so as to get in the right position to run all the way up the center. So that would be the way to make the garment in its sections and stages. So once you've got that panel running up, the zip on, you can see the seam at the top of the shoulder, the elastic on the neckline. The elastic would go around that neckline on the edge of the front curve of the neckline, and sew the rest of the silicone elastic all the way around the vest. And then a lining running up behind the side of the zip that has the zipper head